This is the Retirement Planning University podcast with Jordan Schwartz and Phillis Pulvinas.
Welcome back, friends. I am your host, Jordan Schwartz. I'm joined by my pal, my friend, my colleague, Phillis. Phillis, how are you today?
Hey there, I'm doing great, Jordan. But geez, what a nice way to mention me. Are you sure about that, though?
I am sure about that, unless you've done a great job of deceiving me throughout our professional relationship. I am very confident in those facts. But today we've got a great topic. We're going to talk about the importance of having a diversified portfolio, right? Why I think we have a lot of data that supports it. It doesn't make sense for a retiree to just have stocks in their portfolio. We need other stuff inside the portfolio.
Yeah, so I'd add to that, not just stocks and bonds, which is typically what I see. And when we talk about diversified, I'm not just talking about a lot of stocks or a lot of bonds. People make that mistake. Diversified. Well, I got a ton of stocks. I got a ton of bonds. Hurrah. The market goes down. You go down with it, baby. 10 times or 50 times. Diversified among asset classes is even more important.
So here's what's cool.
We're getting there.
Yeah, so here's what's cool. So if you look inside a mutual fund, what is a mutual fund? Basically, there's what's called a creation unit. And that creation unit is the blueprint of that mutual funds. Let's say it's 15% Apple, 10% Microsoft, 7% Tesla, so on and so forth. So what happens is, to your point exactly, when you look at most people's portfolios, they've got 12 to 15 different mutual funds. Great. But the creation unit of those mutual funds has a tremendous amount of overlap, right? So Philip, I'm looking at someone's portfolio and I see that they've got 15 mutual funds, and I look inside those mutual funds, probably 70 to 80% of those mutual funds are all the exact same, right? There's this idea that we almost have like what I would call it's like fake diversification. You're diversified, but we need to take it a step further. We need to take it to asset allocation.
Yeah, so let's just talk about the different asset allocations that retirees should even consider. What do you think, Jordan?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so when we build plans, we always want a safety bucket. And safety to us is you can't lose anything. And it's got to be a little bit better than the rate of inflation. Safety, not -5, not -10, is -0. And we need a conservative bucket because ultimately, and conservative means that, yeah, you can take a little bit risk, but you're probably going to get a little bit more on your money than safety. But ultimately, something comes up and you need some quick liquidity, you go to your conservative bucket. A moderate bucket. What's moderate? The moderate is where we talk about this a lot in our classes, but where the non-correlated assets live, the alternatives, the things that are not stocks or bonds or insurance products necessarily, the things that zig when the market zags, move in a different direction. And then, of course, we have to have the aggressive part of the portfolio. Every portfolio needs it, so we don't outlive our money, and that's stocks.
I got a question for you, but I also have a comment. So when you look at someone's portfolio, I think there's a misconception that with a lot of advisors, as they think a diversified portfolio means you no longer have risk in your strategy. And that couldn't be further from the case, right? Every good portfolio needs risk, it needs safe, it needs moderate money. But aggressive is pretty simple, right? We know that stock market exposure investments, things like stocks, ETFs, if you have to use in mutual funds. What are some of the investments that one would find as a moderate investment? Maybe we could say, what are some of those non-correlated investments? Because I think that's where a lot of investors sometimes get themselves tripped up, is that their only exposure in their 401ks has been stocks, bonds, and cash, and there haven't been any of those alternatives.
Yeah, so some alternatives might be an exchange traded fund in commodities or in precious metals or I should say, I like to sprinkle a lot of these different things. Maybe an exchange traded fund in real estate. Let's see, what else am I?
We got commodities too, like not just precious metals, but like lithium, oil. You can maybe throw in there structured notes that allows you to customize risk. And I think too, as we move into the next, 10 to 15 years, people will see more and more private equity, which are just access to private markets instead of public markets. So when we look at those investments, that's super helpful, Phil. When we look at those investments, safety, that's going to be probably, I would say, a little bit more of a controversial topic in that not everybody maybe feels the same way that I think you or I would. I think the best tool in the safe money environment is an indexed annuity, right? To me, that's number one. I mean, think about it like this. What's our goal of safety? Try to outpace inflation by 1 to 2 percentage points. To your point, be completely safe and be able to generate some flexible income in the future. Besides an index annuity, Phyllis, what can you name for me that's safe, that does those things, or that has the potential to do those things?
Yeah, really. There's not a lot of tools in the toolbox today. People love to hate annuities, but when you break it down, I'm not product centric, I'm solution centric. And if I'm trying to give somebody that, yeah, the index annuity is generally going to be the best place to go. Some people say, well, let's do a fixed annuity. CD rates are up, interest rates are up. Well, what about in a year and a half from now when they go down and there's a war against the average American saver and that fixed annuity of CD renews that negative 0.1, very low, I should say. Not big.
So with a well-balanced portfolio, and we're kind of looking at it, right? We need safety, we need moderate, we need aggressive. Obviously, the closer you get to retirement, typically the more conservative a strategy should be. I think it's important is that there's not just one way to build a strategy, right? You could have two portfolios. Let's say one has an even mix between safe, moderate, and aggressive. You could have a strategy that has only safe and aggressive investments, but those two have a similar risk profile, they have a similar return profile. Some of this comes down to personal preference when you're building.
Yeah, actually, it's so funny that you say that. Last week, I had two clients with about two couples, same amount of money. One couple, one of the spouses was very risk adverse. The other likes to throw in some risk.
Yeah.
So we did a real split between safety and aggressive. We got to the same risk tolerance, the same amount at risk, same percentage of risk on the overall plan as another couple who were more moderate. They wanted a little bit safe, they wanted a little bit moderate, and they wanted a little bit growth. So two different ways of coming to the table, approaching the same risk tolerance in both. Yeah, absolutely. And it really starts with what is our risk exposure? What's the most we would ever want to see our portfolio go down in a bad market? And then designing the portfolio off that with their comfort level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, anytime I'm meeting with a client and we're building and we're designing a portfolio, something I always like to do is a risk exercise, because I think where a lot of institutions get it wrong is they ask you, are you safe? Are you moderate? Are you aggressive? Right? We have those three definitions there. But what I think a lot of institutions, a lot of advisors neglect to do is understand what does that actually mean, right? Phyllis, I've had clients before where they say aggressive and we put a number to it. They don't want to lose any more than 5%. That doesn't sound aggressive to me. That sounds pretty darn conservative.
Subjective versus objective.
Yes.
Big difference.
So a lot of institutions live in the subjective, and that gets clients into trouble because they think, oh, I'm conservative. Well, if your advisor's definition of conservative is a 20% loss and your definition is 5%, you're going to be in for a nasty surprise when we see market volatility. So I think the first thing is figuring out a numerical value. What is a worst case? We always use 2008 because we plan off of the worst case. You hope for the best, but you plan for the worst. So in 2008, market high to low, peak to trough, fell by about 50%. So the way that I would start to identify risk in my head is, okay, what's the most I would be comfortable seeing my portfolio fall by, knowing it could take me the better half of a half a decade to get back to where I'm at, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. Because what's important too, I think people neglect in our society, we have a unhealthy case of recency bias, right? That's the definition. What it means is because we haven't seen something happen recently, we don't think it's likely to happen again.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I see that all the time because COVID, the market went down and it came right back up. People think that that's just going to be the case. And if anything's going to come back and really hurt them, it's going to be that. Yeah. Let's plan for the worst in retirement because you don't want to go back to work. You don't get a do-over. And if the best happens, let's build a portfolio so that we have enough money to be successful anyway.
Totally. Where if you look back to history, we've got 2008, Brexit, COVID, 9/11. Those are just 4 recent examples of black swan events and economic, somewhat catastrophes. Obviously, we recovered from those. I think we'll always recover from them, but the variable is time. And for a retiree's portfolio, it's important to build a strategy off of the risk exposure because we don't have a decade to get back to where we're at. Or we're not putting between $15,000 to $30,000 a year into a 401k every year to offset the volatility and the risk. So when we're thinking about building a strategy, I just want to recap, Phil, because we're going over a lot of stuff. So the most logical place to start would be figuring out your own unique risk tolerance. What's your worst case comfort level? Now, once you know that, then the variable becomes, okay, how do we build a strategy of different asset classes, which is stock as an asset class, a bond as an asset class? So off of stocks, bonds, real estate, commodities, treasuries, annuities, private equity, preferred stocks, all those non-correlated assets that are moving in directions. I left out a ton. And then the big variable becomes in building a strategy for each individual's risk comfort level. And it's basically the puzzle pieces of how do you get those different tools to fit into place.
Yeah, and there's when you break it down to what the worst case, a number, not just a feeling, the objective. When you break it down, you really can mix and match a lot of pieces. I would add this though, what people are comfortable losing and what they should lose, a good advisor is going to help guide them with that as well. That's an important piece. What they're comfortable and what they should lose are two different things necessarily. And the numbers won't lie. That's why it's important to work off real numbers with your portfolio and percentages of loss.
And I think too, when you're building a well-balanced strategy, you do comprehensive income planning, you're forecasting the next 20 to 30 years, you're looking at inflation. That gives you a lot of feedback for how a portfolio should look, where it might be, hey, I don't want to lose any more than 5%, but if I don't want to run the risk of running out of money, I might have to take a little bit more risk to get a higher return. Or, hey, you look great till the age of 100. Why are you taking this undue risk? Because that could actually end up negatively jeopardizing your retirement.
And when people see the real numbers and they see the logic behind it, it makes so much sense. Let's just make it objective and let's show the logic behind it. And there are a lot of different ways of mix and matching the puzzle, the retirement puzzle, to get to that worst case scenario where they should be and where they want to be. Combination of that.
Something that's really interesting to me, it's this concept. I heard this from Ray Dalio. If you don't know Ray Dalio, he's a genius. He's a top hedge fund manager, Bridgewater Associates. At their peak, they were larger than the second and third largest hedge fund combined. It's incredible returns. He's a genius. Wrote a great book called Principles, has some outstanding videos on YouTubes and different research papers he's written. And there's a concept he's got called risk parity. And this is why diversified portfolios make so much sense, risk parity. So if we think about it, there's just 4 economic scenarios. People always overcomplicate stuff. It doesn't need to be. There's 4 scenarios. There's times when the stock market growth is good, where growth is bad, where inflation is high and inflation is low. Those are the only 4 different economic scenarios. It's those 4. What happens is most people's portfolios are designed to fail. Why? Phyllis, what happens if all your money is in the stock market? How's that going to do when the market's not good?
Yeah, it moves in one direction.
How's it going to do whenever inflation is low or whenever inflation is high?
Yeah, it's gonna move in one direction down, right? But the stock market, certain vehicles, no matter under certain circumstances, are going to move in one direction. Everything's going in that direction. That spells a recipe for disaster. And
Totally.
Unless you have a crystal ball, you in retirement without the paycheck coming in, you need to be nimble, if you will, be able to move in all situations.
And that's the idea that if there's basically 4 different economic seasons and theoretically your portfolio is equally distributed amongst those 4 different economic seasons, if you're like the majority of Americans who are super stock market heavy with a little bit of bond exposure, and bond funds in today's day and age move largely hand in hand with stock funds, now you only are technically positioned to do well about 25% of the time. Now, how long those different seasons vary, but that's where there's people wonder, why am I getting this result? Well, your portfolio is completely in disequilibrium. There's no balance to it.
That's a new word. I like that.
I don't even know if that's a word or not.
I don't know. I like it though. I think I'll
I'm better
start.
at math than I am at grammar. But anyways,
I like making up words.
I do
That's
too.
good.
It's fun. But if we think about it though, if your portfolio is only positioned well for that one different economic scenario, so what's the purpose of non-correlated assets? It's to fill in investments that perform better or well in those economic scenarios versus just stock market exposure. Now, remember too, we're not either oring this. We need stocks in our portfolio.
Right.
It allows us to outpace inflation and grow, but we need the other stuff.
Got to have combinations of all of it, different combinations for different situations, but combinations of all of it. That's a well laid out financial plan for someone who's
Like
going to
that.
retire.
Just thinking of this, Phyllis. So we're very much like 10,000 foot bird's eye view. If I'm sitting here listening to this right now, I'm like, I want more. I want a little bit deeper, or I want to get a little bit more into the weeds. Where do we take this for that listener too, where we're not getting so overly, I guess I call it in my head, I nerd out over this stuff, but where could we take this to go a little bit deeper into the depths? Because I think for someone out there who is either doing it on their own or they want to understand a little bit more, why is my advisor making those decisions? Why do these investments look that way? Where do we go with that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I would send them to my retirement planning class, but I'm just kidding. I mean, that's one option because we do go there. But I would have someone start with how much could their portfolio lose? Where are they positioned right now? Let's get dollars and cents. Let's lose subjectivity. And how much are they comfortable losing? And if that number is out of alignment, well, now you've got to redesign your plan because you have too much beating to one drummer. Or if you just have your typical stock and bond portfolio, now that's another red flag, and you need more diversification.
So maybe the first step then is figuring out, where does my portfolio actually stand?
Yeah.
And once I know that, then I can start to think, how do I close the gap between those two? Where maybe a place we could go as an example would be like, let's say as an example, okay, I'm a 60-year-old, 60 to 65, somewhere around there. I want to retire within the next 10 years, and I want to get more conservative, right? If I'm looking at what should my portfolio look like, I'm thinking, okay, what are kind of some of my like target ranges? So as an example,
Rule of 100.
You could use the rule of 100. You could use the rule of 120. Obviously, people are living longer. But if I'm thinking about that, and this is different for everybody too. We don't want to give you any advice here. Like, this isn't direct guidance, but this is just some kind of logical planning on how we look at things. But if I'm someone, I'm thinking, okay, maybe between 30 to 60% of my net worth could or should be in investments that are either completely safe or very, very conservative and safe, right? Safe would be indexed annuities. Conservative would be a lot of those non-correlated assets that are moving in different directions, a well-balanced portfolio. Balance doesn't mean bonds or fixed income. Part of it could be bonds, but not all of it.
Yeah, floating rate securities, structured notes, stuff like that, along with what people would typically call bonds.
Preferred stocks, convertible, all sorts of stuff like that. So that's very helpful. And then that other part of the portfolio, that 40 to 60%, would be in varying degrees of risk. Now, we're not saying like crypto or options or anything very, very risky. Usually the equity part of the portfolio could be good blue chip companies. Maybe you're looking at some tech, but we're not looking at like leveraged ETFs or shorting the markets or anything risky like that. You look at all the statistics and the studies that shows time in the market is what works, not timing the market.
Perfect. Well said.
What I don't like about that statement, though, is that it doesn't include the variable, which is what we're talking about, is how much time do you have? Because if you got 15 years, it doesn't matter. But if you've got 2 or 3 years, time in the market works until it doesn't work. And that's
why you need a time segmented plan.
Exactly. And that's where risk comes into the equation, building that diversified portfolio.
Absolutely. But I still think that's a powerful statement. When people have all of their money in stocks and all of a sudden they need the money now, well, we're trying to time the market. And that can be a recipe for disaster.
Here's a great statistic. So if you go to Google or Bing, what else is there besides Bing or Google? Is there anything else?
Duck. What is that one?
Yeah, DuckDuckGo. What about Ask Jeeves? That was like 20 years ago. Or YouTube. YouTube's actually the largest search engine, but a lot of you all are probably watching this on YouTube right now. But if you plug in and type that into Google, asset allocation, security selection, and market timing. This is universally accepted in financial services. So about 2%, 2% of the success of your retirement is based upon timing the market. Here's the problem with that, though. Some people think it's just simple, it's just easy enough to do it, but it doesn't work consistently. No one times it. And then what was it about? I think it was like 5% about? How much is it?
5 or 6.
5 or 6, yeah. 5 or 6%. Yeah, it's based on what?
Security selection. Yeah. And people think,
stock.
yeah. I mean, Warren Buffett does it all the time. Why can't I? Well, he doesn't do that. He buys companies that were once, really powerful, and he takes them back to basics and restores them back there. But not everybody's Warren Buffett. So that's why it's 6%.
And then was it 90+% of someone's portfolio is based upon their asset allocation, which for many people, their allocation is a combination of stocks and bonds and cash, which, like we talked about, it works at different times in life, but not for a retiree, really. It just doesn't.
No, they all beat to the same drum, especially stocks and bonds. Yeah, that's unless the market's going to continue to go up in a straight line and interest rates are going to stay low. It's not going to work for a retiree. It's not going to work. And if you have that guarantee, if you have a crystal ball that tells me that, please do a YouTube for me. I want to see it. I want to do it.
So one takeaway for everybody out there listening who's like, hey, I don't think I've got the balance I should have in my portfolio. I'd say a couple of different things that you can look at. One would be looking and seeing, for anyone who's retired, probably the number one thing that's missing is safety. I think for a lot of people, if they're like, what's one or two simple things I could add to my portfolio that would not fix it, but it would at least position me better? One would be looking for some safety in the portfolio.
100% safety. Yes, absolutely. Most people do not have that. And that is not an asset that is underperforming the rate of inflation. That's not really safety. Now you get another problem.
Yeah. Now you're losing money safely.
That's right. Going broke safely.
I like that. And then probably the second thing would be figuring out, like we've talked about, where do you stand? What's your worst case in your portfolio? You could do a stress test. If you have an advisor, your advisor should be able to do it. If they can't, you may want to look around and find someone who can. That could be a red flag there. But
can I just make a point? Test. That's not a Monte Carlo, right? What's a Monte Carlo?
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Let's talk about that for a second. Monte Carlo shows you the probability of success. Well, Phyllis, if you have a 90% probability of success, do you get on an airplane if 10% of the time it's going to go down?
No, that pilot says 90% chance of a safe landing. I'm running for the door. I'm running for the door.
Your portfolio. I like that.
That's what Monte Carlo does for you. It tells you the probability of success. But what if you are that 10%? In all sincerity. So you want a stress test that plans for the worst, hopes for the best. Worst case happens. What's happening to me, and am I surviving it?
I like that. Phil, till next time.
All right. Take care.
You've been listening to the RPU Podcast with Jordan Schwartz and Phyllis Polvinas.